back again with a TBR that I can't possibly complete. I average 4 to 6 books per month. Sometimes I can get in as many as 8, but that's not very often. And it's usually when I have a handful of skinny books to read. And I have 14 books on my list, or I think it's 14. So I'll start with the books that I am absolutely for sure going to be reading in the month of October. The first one is The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. This will be a reread for me, and the reason I'm reading this is because Steve Donahue is doing a reread slash read along for this book. He's doing it with another booktuber, but I don't recall who the other booktuber is. But I'll have that video by Steve linked down in my description. And this is actually my original copy of The Vampire Lestat that I bought when I was 21. I watched the movie Interview with a Vampire, and when I saw that it was based on a book, I absolutely went right out and bought a copy of Interview with a Vampire. And then I read it, loved it, decided I would read the rest. And so I'm really looking forward to a reread of this book. The next book I'm for sure going to be reading in October is Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Jane Austen is one of my favorite authors. I read all of Jane Austen's books when I was in my teens and 20s. I loved every single one of them. Sense and Sensibility is my favorite. And Sean D. Standfast, he's doing a reread of it. And so I'm joining him. And I can't wait to see what he thinks of this book. The next book I am going to be for sure reading is Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. I love this beautiful cover. Just really like it. This is a very thick book, by the way. It's around 800 pages, I do believe. And it's a fantasy, of course. This is a really popular, I believe it's a YA novel, actually. And I have been back and forth about whether or not I wanted to read this. But my friend John is a big fantasy reader, and he is ready to read another book. And so I asked him if he wanted to read Priory of the Orange Tree with me, because I thought if I'm going to read this and I end up not liking it, I'm going to need moral support. So reading it with a friend is the best option. So I will for sure be reading this one. The next book I'm for sure going to read is The Howling by Gary Brandner. So I never really had an interest in reading this book before. It was published in the 70s, and they made a movie based on this book, also called The Howling, and I believe it was made in the late 70s or maybe the early 80s. And I saw that movie a couple of years ago, and I loved it. I'm not a big horror fan, but I absolutely loved that movie. I thought it was so much fun. And I have been wanting to read the book ever since. So this year, I am definitely going to fit it in. It's not very thick, as you can see, so maybe I could read this before I go to bed some night. So the next few books are strong possibility books. If I read these books, and I probably will definitely read those books, but if I manage to get them read before the end of the month and I have extra time to read, then the next book that I would like to read is The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. I saw the 1970s movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers like a year ago. I think it was last summer. And I absolutely loved that movie. It was so good. I couldn't believe how good that is. I don't usually like movies that were made in the 70s. There's just something about the style of the 70s and the film that was available during that time, and even the way stories were being told at that time, in movies at any rate, that just absolutely repel me most of the time. But that movie, loved it. I thought it was amazing, and I had so much to say about that. So I thought that I would rewatch the movie again for Halloween and read the book again. It's not a thick book, and then talk about both in a video. So if I manage to get through those books, I probably will get through those books, and I manage to actually have enough time to do that, then this will be the next book that I reach for. And if I somehow miraculously finish that book, the next one I'm going to reach for is The Omen by David Seltzer. I've wanted to read this forever, for years and years. Also not a big book. And so yeah, hopefully I'm hoping I can get some of these extra books in, especially these two. I'd really like to read this one. The next book that I will be reaching for, if I manage to get through all of those books, is Return from the Dead, selected and introduced by David Stewart Davies, which is a collection of mummy stories. I actually bought this to read during Murder Mayhem, but I ended up not participating in Murder Mayhem, so it's just kind of been sitting around collecting dust all year. So I thought that October would be a good time to read that. So maybe I can get to this one. Who knows? Miracles do happen. The next book that I may or may not be reading this month is Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey, which is the first book in the Expanse series. My closest friend, Eric, who is also my roommate, he absolutely loves the Expanse TV series. And he is really interested in reading the books, and he rarely ever reads books. But he said he did want to try the first book in this series. So I bought us both a copy, and he has read about 10 pages, and that was 2 weeks ago. So we'll see if he actually continues reading it. And if he does, I figure that I probably won't read this until November because he reads very slowly. And so I'm not even going to start this book until he is at least halfway through it. But I honestly don't expect to be reading this until November. Okay, so if I somehow manage to finish all of the books that I have already talked about, I have 2 more books that I would like to read. This one, Ghosts of Vesuvius by Charles Pellegrino, is a nonfiction. I'm going to read you the tagline. A new look at the last days of Pompeii, how towers fall, and other strange connections. I saw Steve Donahue talking about this on his channel just real recently, and it sounds absolutely fascinating. I'm dying to read this book. So I'm hoping to get this read in October. I'm absolutely certain it's not going to happen. It'll probably be November or December before I actually get around to reading this book, but I'm throwing it on the stack just in case. You never know. And the last book that I would like to read in the month of October is The Biggest Ideas in the Universe by Sean Carroll, Space, Time, and Motion. This book sounds like it's going to be really good. It's not terribly big. I've kind of flipped through here and read little bits here and there. There's a lot of math in it, which is going to be way over my head because math and I are not friends. But I had pre-ordered this a while back, and I was going to read this for the Book Trek 2022 Away Mission. However, I ran out of time to read this because I was just way too obsessed with reading Book Trek, and then also Autumn Amore happened in September as well. So I just was reading almost exclusively Star Trek books and romance novels, and so I just never got to this. I'd like to be able to read this in October, but again, I'm sure it's not going to happen. I'll probably have to read this in November or December. So yeah, that is I really shouldn't call it a TBR. I should really call this my October wish list. But I will at least get through those first few that I mentioned. And having said that, I'll call this the end of the video.